They say you can't run from your mistakes. But what if you don't want to run? What if the thrill of those mistakes makes you feel more alive than you've ever felt before? I've asked myself that question too many times now, as I stand here, looking out of the window of this old house, feeling the weight of everything that's come crashing down. I could tell you that what happened between me and Luke was something I never intended, that it was a momentary lapse of judgment, a reckless, foolish decision that came out of nowhere. But the truth is much darker than that. It wasn't just a moment, and it didn't come out of nowhere. I'm 65 years old. I've lived through more than most women my age could claim. A long marriage, 2 grown children, and the years filled with everything that's supposed to be right: stability, respect, comfort. Tom and I have had a good life together. But underneath all of that, there was something missing, something I couldn't name, something that started gnawing at me in the quiet hours of the night. And then there was Luke. What began as a few innocent conversations turned into something I couldn't control. It should have ended after that first night in the hotel room, the night where everything changed, when Luke and I did the unthinkable while Tom slept just a few feet away. But that night didn't end it. No, it was just the beginning. Now I stand here wondering if I'll lose everything, because secrets have a way of catching up to you, especially when they involve someone half your age. But you already know that, don't you? You're here because you want to know how it all fell apart. So let me tell you, life was predictable before Luke came into the picture. Tom and I had settled into a rhythm that was neither particularly happy nor particularly sad. We were just existing. Every morning I would wake up to the soft hum of the coffee machine, the sound of Tom flipping through the morning paper, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that we had made it through another day together. We had 2 children, Sarah and Michael. Both grown, both successful in their own right. Sarah, a psychologist, had her practice in the city. She was the more observant of the 2, always watching, always questioning. Michael, on the other hand, worked in finance and was too busy with his own life to notice the small cracks forming in ours. Our marriage, in its early days, had been full of love and excitement, but as the years went on, that love turned into something more like companionship. Not that I didn't appreciate Tom. He was a good man, a reliable man. But as I entered my 60s, I started to wonder if reliable was enough. Was this really it? Was this how the rest of my life would go? My days were filled with the usual things women of my age tend to do: book clubs, volunteering at the community center, and the occasional lunch with friends like Helen, who would always gossip about other people's affairs but never mention the cold distance in her own marriage. I was good at pretending, too, pretending that everything in my life was perfectly fine, until the reunion. It was one of those rare family gatherings where everyone was under the same roof: Tom's side of the family, mine, and a few people I hadn't seen in years. That's when I first saw Luke. He was Tom's stepbrother's son. I hadn't seen him since he was a teenager, and now, standing across the room, he was no longer the awkward boy I remembered. He was a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, with that carefree confidence that only someone in their 20s can pull off. I noticed him, and to my surprise, he noticed me too. We exchanged a few words at the reunion. Nothing scandalous, nothing inappropriate, just small talk. He asked about my life, my retirement, and I asked about his music. He played guitar in a band, still trying to make it big. I admired his passion, his drive, his youth. There was something about him that made me feel young again, as though I wasn't a woman on the edge of old age, but someone who could still be desired, still be wanted. Looking back, I should have known better than to entertain the thoughts that started swirling in my head after that night. But I didn't stop them. I let them take root. I let them grow. It wasn't long after the reunion that Luke reached out to me. It started innocently enough, a message on social media, something about how it was nice to see me again after all these years. I replied, and from there the conversation continued. Day after day we exchanged messages, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. It felt harmless at first, just a friendly connection, but there was something else beneath the surface, something neither of us said out loud. Luke was much younger than me, but he had a way of making me feel seen, in a way that Tom hadn't in years. He would ask about my thoughts, my opinions, my dreams. I found myself looking forward to his messages more than I should have. The first time we met outside of the reunion was at a coffee shop. It was supposed to be just a friendly catch-up. That's what I told myself, at least. But the way Luke looked at me, it wasn't friendly. There was something more in his eyes, something that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. We talked for hours, and when it was time to leave, he asked if we could meet again. I said yes without thinking, and just like that, the boundaries that I should have kept up began to crumble. The next time we met, it was at a hotel. I had told Tom I was going out with friends, and he didn't ask any questions. Why would he? After all, we had always trusted each other. As I walked into that hotel room, my heart was pounding in my chest. Luke was already there, waiting for me, and when I saw him, all the guilt, all the reasons why I shouldn't be there, seemed to disappear. That night, everything changed. We crossed a line, one that I knew we couldn't uncross. It wasn't just the physical act of being with Luke, though that in itself was enough to make my hands shake when I thought about it later. It was the emotional line we crossed. The connection that had been building between us finally became something real, something tangible. When it was over, we lay there on the hotel bed, the sheets tangled around us, the weight of what we had done hanging in the air. I should have felt ashamed. I should have regretted everything. But I didn't. All I could feel was the thrill, the excitement, the rush of adrenaline that came from doing something so wrong, something that no one would ever expect of me. Tom was in the next room, oblivious to what was happening. The irony of it all made my stomach twist in knots. I thought about him sleeping soundly, unaware that his wife, the woman he had trusted for over 30 years, was betraying him just a few feet away. I told myself that it would be the only time, that I wouldn't let it happen again. But even as I thought those words, I knew they weren't true, because something had been awakened in me that night, something I couldn't ignore. Luke was like a drug, and I was already addicted. The days after that first night with Luke felt like a blur. Every time I looked at Tom, I felt a mix of guilt and exhilaration. How could I have done this to him? How could I have betrayed the man who had stood by my side through thick and thin, who had given me 2 beautiful children, who had always been there when I needed him? But even as I asked myself those questions, I couldn't stop thinking about Luke. His touch, his smile, the way he made me feel young again. It was intoxicating, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push him out of my mind. We started meeting regularly after that night. At first it was just coffee or lunch, innocent enough, but it didn't take long before those meetings turned into something more. We would rent hotel rooms, always careful to make sure no one saw us. The secrecy of it all only added to the thrill. I felt like a teenager sneaking around behind my parents' backs, except this time I was sneaking behind my husband's. Every time I came home after seeing Luke, I would feel a wave of guilt wash over me. I would look at Tom, sitting there in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper, completely unaware of what I had been doing. He trusted me, and I was betraying that trust in the worst way possible. I told myself I had to stop, that I couldn't keep doing this to him. But the more I tried to pull away from Luke, the more I found myself drawn to him. It wasn't just the physical connection between us, though that was a big part of it. It was the way he made me feel. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I felt desirable. I felt like I mattered. But it wasn't long before the cracks in my double life started to show. Tom began to notice the changes in me. I was more distant, more distracted. I would come home later than usual, making excuses about where I had been. At first he didn't say anything, but I could see the suspicion growing in his eyes. He would ask me questions, innocent ones at first. How was your lunch with Helen? Did you have a good time at the book club? But I could tell he was fishing for something, trying to figure out what was really going on. Then there was Sarah. Sarah had always been the more perceptive of our two children. As a psychologist, she was trained to read people, to pick up on the small details that others might miss. It didn't take long for her to notice the changes in me as well. She would ask me about my day, about how things were going with Tom, but her questions were always laced with an undertone of suspicion. I tried to brush it off, to act like everything was normal, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep up the facade. The worst part was the fear. Every time I was with Luke, there was a part of me that was terrified of being caught. I would check my phone constantly, worried that Tom might call or that Sarah might drop by unexpectedly. I started lying more and more, spinning webs of deceit that became increasingly difficult to keep track of. And then, one day I came home to find Tom sitting at the kitchen table, a look of concern on his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with those piercing blue eyes that had once made me fall in love with him. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "is there something you need to tell me?" My heart skipped a beat. Did he know? Had he found out about Luke? I forced a smile, trying to act casual. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "You've been distant lately, distracted. I feel like something's changed between us." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I did my best to keep my composure. "Tom, I've just been busy. You know how things are with the volunteer work and the book club. I'm sorry if I've seemed distant." But even as I said the words, I knew he didn't believe me. The look in his eyes told me that he suspected more than I was letting on. I had to be more careful. If Tom found out about the affair, it would destroy everything. Our marriage, our family, everything we had built together over the years. But as much as I wanted to stop, I couldn't. Luke had become a part of me now, and I didn't know how to let go. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of the affair with Luke began to take a greater toll on me. Keeping up the appearance of normalcy around Tom and our children was exhausting. I was constantly on edge, wondering if I'd left some clue behind, some trace of the secret life I was leading. And then there was Sarah. It wasn't long before she became more inquisitive, her natural instincts as a psychologist kicking in. I hadn't seen her this concerned about me in years, and it only made me feel more exposed. She was relentless with her subtle but pointed questions. I could feel her watching me, trying to decode the changes in my behavior. "Mom, are you sure everything's all right?" she asked one evening during one of her routine visits. Her eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as though searching for cracks in my facade. I forced a laugh, trying to brush her off. "Sarah, please, I'm fine. Just a little tired. You know how it is, the endless committees and the community work." She nodded but didn't look convinced. There was something in her gaze, a kind of skepticism, as if she was waiting for me to slip up and say something I wasn't supposed to, and I knew, deep down, that if anyone could figure out what I was hiding, it would be Sarah. It didn't help that Luke had grown more brazen. He started sending me messages at odd times, messages that were riskier than before. He'd begun asking to meet more frequently, pushing for us to spend more time together. I could feel him becoming impatient, as though our secret meetings in hotel rooms and brief coffee dates weren't enough anymore. There was one night when Luke called me late. Tom was asleep in the bedroom, his soft snores filtering through the house. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding, and crept into the living room to answer. Margaret, Luke's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. "I've been thinking, maybe we should stop hiding this." I froze, the phone pressed to my ear. every muscle in my body tensing. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, I don't want to be your secret anymore," he continued. "I don't like feeling like I'm some dirty little affair you're ashamed of." "Luke, it's not that simple," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Tom was still asleep. I could hear his deep breathing from here. "You don't understand. If Tom finds out, it'll destroy everything. My family, my life. I can't just—" "Maybe it's time you made a choice," Luke interrupted. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he added, "Me or him." The silence that followed his words felt suffocating. My mind raced, but I couldn't find the right response. How had this happened? How had I gone from an innocent flirtation to this standing at the edge of a cliff, forced to make a decision that could ruin everything? "I have to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I hung up before he could say anything else, the weight of his ultimatum pressing down on me. As I crawled back into bed beside Tom, the guilt gnawed at me like never before. What had I gotten myself into? Luke's words echoed in my mind, "me or him." I had never even considered leaving Tom. The idea was absurd, but the affair with Luke had pulled me so far out of the world I'd built for myself that I no longer knew which way was up. The next morning, Tom seemed unusually quiet at breakfast. He was sipping his coffee, staring at the newspaper, but I could tell something was off. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Tom glanced up at me, his expression unreadable. "Margaret," he began slowly, "I've been meaning to ask, have you been happy lately?" The question caught me off guard. I fumbled with my cup, nearly spilling coffee on the table. "What do you mean?" He sighed, folding the paper and setting it aside. "You've seemed different these past few months, distant, distracted. I just want to make sure everything's okay." My mind raced. Did he know? Had he figured it out? I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out more defensive than I intended. "I've just been busy, Tom, that's all." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The problem with Tom was that he wasn't a man who confronted things directly. He would let his suspicions simmer under the surface, waiting for the right moment to bring them up. And that scared me more than anything. I couldn't predict when he might suddenly demand answers. As the weeks passed, I grew more paranoid. I began deleting my messages with Luke as soon as they came through, constantly checking my phone for any signs that Tom or Sarah might have seen something they shouldn't. But the pressure was building, and it was becoming harder to keep the walls from crumbling around me. One evening, after weeks of mounting tension, the inevitable happened. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book, when Tom walked in with a strange look on his face. I could tell right away that something was wrong. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at me. Then, without a word, he pulled something from his pocket and held it up for me to see. It was my phone. My heart dropped into my stomach. I had left it on the kitchen counter earlier, not thinking anything of it. I always deleted the messages from Luke, but I hadn't thought to check the call log. I should have been more careful. "Margaret," Tom said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "What's going on?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My mind was spinning, trying to think of some plausible explanation, but there was none. He had seen the call from Luke. He knew. "Who is he?" Tom asked, his voice breaking. "Who's Luke?" The room felt like it was closing in around me. I had no choice but to tell the truth, or at least some version of it. There was no point in denying it anymore. I took a deep breath, my chest tight with guilt. "Tom," I began, my voice shaking. I made a mistake." He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "A mistake? You've been talking to him for months, Margaret. This isn't just a mistake." I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. It started as nothing, just a friendship. But it got out of hand. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear." Tom sat down heavily on the couch, his hands trembling. He looked so vulnerable in that moment, so heartbroken. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I couldn't. I had done this. I had shattered his world. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this to us?" I didn't have a good answer. How could I explain the pull that Luke had on me, the way he made me feel alive again? How could I tell Tom that, after years of marriage, I had started to feel invisible? That Luke's attention had made me feel like a woman again, not just a wife or a mother? "I don't know," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I didn't want to hurt you." For a long time he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the floor, as if trying to process what I had told him. I could see the pain etched into his face, the betrayal written in every line. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke my heart all over again. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer for that either. I had been so wrapped up in the affair, in the thrill and the secrecy, that I hadn't thought about what would happen if it all came crashing down. I hadn't thought about the consequences. "I don't know," I said again, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know." The days after the confrontation with Tom were some of the longest of my life. The silence between us was suffocating. We lived in the same house, but it was as though we were ghosts, moving around each other without speaking. Tom hadn't said much since that night. He didn't ask for details, didn't demand to know how long the affair had been going on, or how far it had gone. But the pain in his eyes every time he looked at me said more than any words ever could. I had expected him to rage, to scream, to throw things, but instead Tom did what he had always done. He withdrew. He buried his emotions deep inside, where I couldn't reach them. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to end things with Luke, to try and repair the damage I had done to my marriage, but another part of me, the part that had been so consumed by desire and excitement, couldn't let go of him. Even now, after everything, I still felt that pull toward him. But Luke was becoming impatient. He had always been more impulsive than me, less concerned with the consequences. He started showing up at my usual spots, places where we used to meet in secret, like the coffee shop and the park. It wasn't just the messages anymore. He wanted more. One afternoon I was sitting in my car outside the community center where I volunteered when I saw Luke's familiar figure walking toward me. My heart raced, a mix of panic and excitement flooding through me. "Luke, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can't just show up like this." "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone serious. "We can't keep doing this, Margaret. I can't keep being your dirty little secret." I glanced around nervously. People from the center were starting to leave for the day, and the last thing I needed was for someone to see us together. "We'll talk later," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not here." But Luke wasn't listening. His jaw was clenched, and I could see the frustration in his eyes. "No, we need to talk now. I'm not going to wait around for you to figure out what you want. I'm tired of this." There was something dangerous in his tone, something I hadn't heard from him before. I had always thought I was in control of the situation, but now I wasn't so sure. Luke was no longer the carefree young man I had first met. He was becoming possessive, demanding. "Luke, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to go." He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, his expression darkening. "You need to make a choice, Margaret. Either you leave him, or I walk away." Panic surged through me. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to make a decision. But Luke was forcing my hand, and I didn't know how to stop him. Before I could respond, I heard a voice behind me. "Mom." I froze. Slowly I turned around to see Sarah standing there, her face a mask of confusion and concern. She had seen us. She had heard us. There was no denying it now. "Sarah," I began, but the words died in my throat. What could I possibly say to her? How could I explain what she had just witnessed? "Is this him?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Is this the man you've been seeing?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The look of betrayal in her eyes was too much for me to bear. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with Luke, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything was falling apart, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. After Sarah walked away that afternoon, I knew everything was unraveling faster than I could control. The look on her face, the shock, the betrayal haunted me in every quiet moment. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and any wrong move would send me tumbling into an abyss I could never escape from. But the thing was, I had already taken that step. I was already falling. Tom had been distant since the confrontation, but he hadn't brought it up again. That silence between us was suffocating. I found myself wishing he'd shout, argue anything to break through the oppressive quiet that now filled our home. But Tom wasn't that kind of man. His way of dealing with things had always been to withdraw, to bottle it all up inside. The worst part was knowing that Sarah now knew. She had seen Luke and me together. She hadn't said a word to Tom yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I could feel the tension building every time she came over, the way she looked at me, her eyes filled with disappointment and anger. I hadn't spoken to Luke since that day outside the community center. He had texted me a few times, but I hadn't replied. I needed to think, to figure out what I was going to do. Luke had pushed me to make a decision, but I wasn't ready. How could I be? My entire life was falling apart, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. One evening, about a week after Sarah had caught us, I was sitting in the kitchen when Tom came home. He looked more worn than usual, his face lined with stress. He barely glanced at me as he put his keys down on the counter and walked into the living room. I followed him, my heart racing, knowing that something was about to happen. "Tom," I called softly, standing in the doorway. He didn't turn around. Instead, he sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. "I talked to Sarah," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. My breath caught in my throat. So it had finally happened. The truth was out, and there was no going back now. "I didn't want to believe it," Margaret. Tom continued, still not looking at me. "I didn't want to believe that you could, that you would do something like this." "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Tom, I never meant to hurt you. I never." Why, he cut me off, finally lifting his head to look at me. His eyes were red, filled with hurt and confusion. "Why would you do this to us? After everything we've been through, after all these years?" I didn't know how to answer him. How could I explain the loneliness, the desire, the feeling that something was missing? How could I make him understand what had driven me into Luke's arms? But even as I searched for the right words, I knew that nothing I said would make a difference. The damage was done. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why." Tom stared at me for a long moment, and then, without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room. I heard the door to the guest bedroom close softly behind him. The next few days were a blur. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. Tom had moved into the guest bedroom and barely spoke to me. Sarah had stopped coming by altogether, and I hadn't heard from Michael in weeks. I was alone, completely and utterly alone, with only my thoughts and regrets to keep me company. It was in that silence that I made a decision. I needed to end things with Luke. There was no other option. Whatever thrill or excitement I had felt with him had long since been overshadowed by guilt and fear. I couldn't keep living this double life, couldn't keep hurting the people I loved. I texted Luke that afternoon, asking him to meet me at the hotel where we'd been meeting for months. My hands shook as I typed the message, knowing that this would be the last time I saw him. He replied almost immediately, agreeing to meet in an hour. When I arrived at the hotel, Luke was already there, waiting for me in the lobby. He looked different, tense, agitated. His usual carefree demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and walked over to him. "We need to talk," I said quietly. Luke's eyes narrowed. I figured. We went up to the room in silence, and as soon as the door closed behind us, I turned to face him. "This has to stop," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I can't do this anymore." Luke stared at me for a long moment, and then he laughed a cold, bitter laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You're breaking up with me? After everything we've been through, you're just going to walk away?" "I don't have a choice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My family, I've already lost so much because of this. I can't lose everything." Luke's expression darkened. He took a step toward me, and for the first time I felt a flicker of fear. "You think you can just end this, like it never happened? Like I'm some fling you can brush aside?" "Luke, please," I said, backing up slightly. "This isn't about you, it's about me. I've made a mess of things, and I need to fix it." He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "No, Margaret, you don't get to decide when this ends. I do." I felt my heart pounding in my chest, the fear rising with every word he said. "What are you talking about?" "You think you can just go back to your perfect little life with Tom," Luke sneered, his voice filled with venom. "You think you can erase me from your life, like I never mattered? I won't let you." "Luke, stop," I said, my voice trembling. "You're scaring me." He took another step toward me, and I could see the anger boiling in his eyes. "You should be scared, Margaret. You have no idea what I'm capable of." I froze, my mind racing. This wasn't the Luke I had known, the young, charming man who had made me feel alive again. This was someone else, someone dangerous. "Luke, don't do this," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "Please." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, and I could see that I had lost control of the situation. I had pushed him too far, and now there was no turning back. Without warning, he lunged toward me, grabbing my arm with a force that made me cry out in pain. I struggled to pull away, but he held on tight, his grip like a vise. "Luke, stop," I screamed, panic flooding my veins. But he didn't stop. He was out of control, consumed by his anger and frustration. In that moment, I realized that I had no idea who this man really was. I had been so blinded by my own desires that I had ignored the warning signs, and now I was paying the price. I managed to pull free from his grip, stumbling backward toward the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could think about was getting out of that room, away from him. But before I could reach the door, Luke grabbed me again, his hands rough and unforgiving. He shoved me against the wall, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and angry. "You think you can just leave me," he snarled. "You think you can run back to your husband and pretend this never happened." "Luke, please," I sobbed, my voice broken. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But my words meant nothing to him. He was too far gone, too consumed by his own rage. I had pushed him too far, and now I was facing the consequences. In the chaos of the moment, I didn't hear the door open. I didn't see Tom standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. It wasn't until Luke was pulled off of me, until I heard the sound of a struggle behind me, that I realized what had happened. I turned around just in time to see Tom and Luke grappling with each other, their movements wild and frantic. Tom had somehow found me, somehow known where I would be, and now he was trying to save me from the man who had once made me feel alive but was now threatening to destroy everything. The fight was brutal, chaotic. I watched in horror as Tom and Luke wrestled, their fists flying, their voices shouting. It all happened so fast, and yet it felt like it was unfolding in slow motion. And then, in one terrible moment, it was over. Luke lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Tom stood over him, his chest heaving, his face ashen. The room was silent, except for the sound of my ragged breathing. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the man lying on the floor, the man who had once made me feel so alive, and the man who had now paid the ultimate price for my mistakes. The hours after the police arrived were surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was questioned, though the officers seemed more concerned about making sure I was physically unharmed than getting a full account of what had happened. They took photos of the room, of Luke lying still on the floor, and of Tom sitting in the hallway, his hands trembling, his face blank. Tom didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since pulling Luke off of me. I wanted to reach out to him, to say something, anything to make sense of the chaos we had found ourselves in, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, numb and shaking, when one of the officers approached me. "Mrs. Anderson, we're going to take your husband down to the station for questioning. It's standard procedure in a case like this." I nodded, though I barely understood what he was saying. Tom had acted in self-defense, I knew that. The police knew that, but still, the reality of the situation was inescapable. Luke was dead. The young man I had once shared stolen moments with, the man who had made me feel alive again, was gone. And Tom, the husband I had betrayed, had been the one to end it all. "I'll need you to come down to the station as well," the officer continued, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll need your statement." I nodded again, feeling like a puppet, my body moving on autopilot. I didn't know what I would say when they asked me to explain what had happened. How could I tell them about the affair, about the months of lies and deceit, about how everything had spiraled so far out of control? As they led Tom away in handcuffs, I saw Sarah standing outside the hotel. Her face was pale, her expression frozen in shock. She hadn't been there when the police arrived, but someone must have called her. She must have come as soon as she heard. Our eyes met, and for a moment I thought she would run to me, that she would embrace me, tell me everything would be all right. But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher, part anger, part sadness, part disbelief. And then she turned away. At the police station, I sat in a small, sterile room, staring at the blank walls as I waited to be questioned. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. My mind kept replaying the events of that evening, over and over again, like a broken record I couldn't stop. Eventually, a detective came in and sat across from me. He was calm, professional, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. This wasn't just a routine case for him. It was a scandal, a woman in her 60s, a mother, a wife, caught in an affair with a man half her age, and now that man was dead. He wanted answers, and he knew I was the only one who could give them. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, his voice steady but probing, "can you tell me what happened tonight?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling in my lap. It's complicated," I whispered. "I understand that this is difficult," the detective said, leaning forward slightly, "but we need to understand how things escalated to this point. How did you know the victim, Luke?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There was no use lying now. The truth was going to come out one way or another, and maybe in some twisted way I owed it to everyone to be honest for the first time in months. "He was my lover," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. The detective didn't react, though I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or maybe judgment. He scribbled something down in his notebook, then looked back up at me. How long had the affair been going on? Several months, I admitted, my voice barely audible. We met at a family gathering and one thing led to another. And your husband, Tom, when did he find out about the affair? I felt my chest tighten. Not long ago. A few days, maybe a week. He confronted me, but I didn't. I didn't tell him everything. The detective nodded, continuing to take notes. And what happened tonight? Why were you at the hotel with Luke? I was trying to end it, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I didn't want to continue the affair. I wanted to fix things with Tom. But Luke, he didn't take it well. He became angry, aggressive. He wouldn't let me leave. The detective glanced up at me, his expression thoughtful. And that's when your husband arrived. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. Tom must have followed me. He saw what was happening and tried to stop Luke. They fought, and I couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of it was too much to bear. The detective closed his notebook and sat back in his chair, studying me for a moment. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Anderson. We'll need to verify everything, but based on what you've told me, it seems like a tragic case of self-defense. I nodded numbly, though the word tragic felt like an understatement. This was more than just a tragedy, it was a disaster of my own making, one that had cost Luke his life and torn my family apart. Tom was released the next day after the police determined that he had indeed acted in self-defense, but the scars of what had happened, the emotional scars, were not so easily erased. We returned home in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us like a dark cloud. Tom didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but I didn't know where to begin. How could I ask for forgiveness when I wasn't even sure I deserved it? Sarah and Michael stayed away. I hadn't heard from either of them since the night at the hotel. I didn't blame them. I knew they were hurt, angry, confused. I had betrayed them as much as I had betrayed Tom. I had destroyed the image of the family they thought they knew, shattered the illusion of the perfect mother, the devoted wife. Days passed in a blur of silence and isolation. Tom spent most of his time in the guest room, and I was left to wander the empty house, haunted by the memories of what I had done. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the life we had once shared, the life I had thrown away for a brief, reckless affair with a man who was now gone. And then, one afternoon, Sarah came to visit. I hadn't been expecting her, so when I opened the door and saw her standing there, I was momentarily speechless. She looked different, older somehow. There was a hardness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "Mom," she said, her voice cold and distant, "we need to talk." I stepped aside, letting her into the house. She didn't sit down, didn't take off her coat. She stood in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on me. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said bluntly, cutting straight to the point. "I'm not sure I ever will. What you did, it was selfish, and it hurt all of us." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I know," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for any of this to happen." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Mom, you had an affair with a man young enough to be your son. You lied to Dad, to all of us, for months. And now that man is dead and you're just standing here acting like you didn't have a choice." Her words stung, but I knew she was right. I had made choices that had led us all to this moment. There was no excusing what I had done. "I'm not here to make you feel better," Sarah continued, her voice sharp. "I'm here because Dad is falling apart, and he needs you. I don't know how you're going to fix this, if you even can, but you need to try. You owe him that much." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I will," I promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and then she shook her head, her expression softening ever so slightly. "I hope you mean that, Mom. Because this family is hanging by a thread, and if you don't fix it, we're going to lose everything." And with that, she turned and walked out of the house, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than ever. That night, I knocked on the door to the guest room. Tom hadn't spoken to me in days, but after Sarah's visit, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. We needed to really talk about what had happened, about where we stood, about whether there was anything left to salvage. "Tom," I called softly through the door. "Can I come in?" There was a long silence, and then I heard the door unlock. I pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. Tom was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, his eyes downcast. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. The words felt inadequate, but I had to try. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything I've done, for the lies, the betrayal, for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I—" Tom cut me off with a quiet sigh. "Margaret, stop." I fell silent, my heart pounding in my chest. He still wasn't looking at me, and I wondered if he ever would again. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, "thinking about us, about what we've become. And I realized I don't know who you are anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had feared that I had changed so much, that I had drifted so far from the woman Tom had once loved, that there was no going back. "I'm still me," I said softly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "I'm still the woman you married." Tom shook his head, finally lifting his gaze to meet mine. His eyes were filled with a sadness that broke my heart all over again. "No, Margaret, you're not. The woman I married would never have done this. The woman I married would have talked to me if she was unhappy, instead of running off with some boy." I flinched at the harshness of his words, but I knew they were true. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and there was no denying that. "I know I've changed," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But I want to fix things, Tom. I want to try." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if we can fix this, Margaret. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to hold them back. "I'll do whatever it takes," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything. Just don't give up on us." Tom looked away, his jaw tight. "It's not that simple." I stood there waiting, hoping, praying that he would say something, anything that would give me a sliver of hope. But the silence stretched on, and I knew that nothing I said could undo the damage that had been done. The weeks that followed were a blur of counseling sessions, long, painful conversations, and moments of heartbreaking silence. Tom and I were both trying, in our own ways, to rebuild what had been broken. But it wasn't easy. The wounds were too deep, the scars too fresh. We started going to therapy together, though it felt like we were walking on eggshells most of the time. The counselor, an older woman with a calm, soothing voice, encouraged us to be honest with each other, to express our feelings, our fears. But every time I looked at Tom, all I could see was the pain I had caused him. How could I expect him to forgive me when I wasn't sure I could even forgive myself? "I don't know how to move past this," Tom admitted during one of our sessions. "I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering what I missed, what I could have done differently." "It wasn't your fault," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. "This was my mistake. I made a terrible choice, and I'm so sorry, Tom." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I just don't understand how we got here, Margaret. We had a good life. We weren't perfect, but we were happy, weren't we?" I didn't know how to answer him. In many ways, we had been happy. We had built a life together, raised two wonderful children, and weathered the ups and downs of marriage like any other couple. But somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of that happiness. I had let myself believe that there was something more out there, something I was missing, and in chasing that feeling, I had lost everything. I thought I was missing something, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong, Tom. I was so wrong. The counselor leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but firm. Margaret, it's important that you allow yourself to feel these emotions, but you also need to be honest about what led you to this point. Affairs don't happen in a vacuum. I nodded, though the guilt still weighed heavily on me. I felt invisible, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. For years I felt like I was just existing, like I wasn't seen or heard anymore. And when Luke came along, he made me feel alive again. He made me feel like I mattered. Tom flinched at the mention of Luke's name, and I immediately regretted saying it. But the counselor didn't let me shy away from it. It's important to acknowledge these feelings, she said gently. But it's also important to understand that seeking validation outside of your marriage can have devastating consequences, as you've seen. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I know, and I regret it more than anything. But I don't want to lose us, Tom. I don't want to lose you. Tom stared at me for a long moment, his expression conflicted. I could see the pain, the anger, and the sadness all warring inside him. But there was something else there too, something softer, something that gave me a glimmer of hope. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, he said finally, his voice quiet. But I'm willing to try. For us. For our family. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness. It wasn't a guarantee that we would heal. But it was a start, and in that moment it was enough. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Tom and I took small steps, trying to reconnect, trying to find a new normal. There were days when it felt impossible, when the weight of the past threatened to pull us under. But there were also days when I saw glimpses of the love we had once shared, moments of laughter, of quiet understanding, of hope. Sarah and Michael remained distant, though over time Sarah softened. She came to visit more often, and while things were still tense between us, we were slowly beginning to repair our relationship. Michael, on the other hand, kept his distance, his anger and disappointment still too raw to face me. I couldn't blame him. I had shattered the image of the mother he thought he knew, and it would take time, if ever, for him to come to terms with that. As for Luke, his memory lingered, a ghost that haunted me in the quiet moments. I thought about him often, about the man I had known and the man he had become in those final moments. I would never be able to reconcile the two, never be able to fully understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. But I had to live with the consequences of my actions, and part of that meant accepting that Luke was gone. The guilt and grief would never fully disappear, but I was learning to live with it, to carry it without letting it destroy me. It was a heavy burden, but it was mine to bear. In the end, redemption wasn't something that came easily, if it came at all. Tom and I were still a work in progress, and there were days when I wondered if we would ever truly heal. But we were trying, and that had to be enough. I had made a terrible mistake, one that had cost me more than I could have ever imagined. But I was still standing. I was still here with my family, with my husband, trying to pick up the pieces of the life I had shattered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was something. And for now, that was enough.
Sometimes the smallest, most ordinary moments hold the power to change your life completely. That's what happened to me. One moment, I was a stepmother, hosting a polite gathering at an art gallery, navigating the usual awkwardness of family connections. The next, I was stuck in an elevator with my husband's son, a young man I had barely exchanged more than pleasantries with before that night. What happened between those steel walls wasn't something I could have anticipated. I've always prided myself on being a woman of reason, someone who could weigh choices and consequences. But the way Ian looked at me, the way he spoke as if every word mattered, it unlocked something in me that I hadn't realized was still there. It wasn't just the long hours of confinement that drew us together, nor the shared vulnerability of the situation. It was the realization of how deeply we were both yearning for something we couldn't define until we saw it in each other. By the time those elevator doors finally opened, everything in my world had shifted. And the truth? The most complicated part wasn't what happened in that confined space. It was everything that came after. The gallery was alive with soft music and the hum of polite conversation. My husband David had insisted I attend in his place. "Ian's showing his work tonight," he had said casually over breakfast, his attention already on the day's meetings. "You should go. Show him some support." I had agreed, though more out of obligation than genuine interest. Ian and I had always been cordial but distant. He was polite to me, and I did my best to respect his independence. He had lost his mother young, and I knew that my role as his father's second wife came with its own complications. When I arrived at the gallery, I spotted Ian across the room, standing beside a series of abstract paintings. He was taller than I remembered, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression focused yet relaxed as he spoke with a small group of patrons. I waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Margaret," he said warmly, his smile lighting up his face. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "Of course," I replied. "Your father couldn't come, but he sends his congratulations." We fell into easy conversation about his work, his tone a mixture of pride and self-deprecation. I noticed the way he lit up when he spoke about his art, the passion in his voice. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, and it intrigued me. After the event, we left together. Ian offered to drive me home, but I insisted we take the elevator up together when we reached the building. It felt natural, polite even. Neither of us could have known what awaited us. The elevator hummed softly as it began its ascent. I pressed the button for the penthouse, leaning back against the polished steel wall. Ian stood beside me, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator stopped. The lights flickered before settling into the dim glow of the emergency setting. Ian and I exchanged a glance. "Did it just?" he started. "It stopped," I finished, pressing the button for the intercom. No response. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. "Guess we're stuck," Ian said with a faint smile, leaning against the wall. At first, we approached the situation with practicality, taking turns calling out and knocking on the walls. When it became clear that help wasn't coming anytime soon, we sat down, resigned to waiting. As the minutes stretched into hours, we began to talk. Not just about the elevator, but about ourselves. Ian asked about my life before I met his father, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't thought about in years. In return, he spoke about his struggles as an artist, his feelings of inadequacy, and the pressure of living up to his father's expectations. "I think he wants me to be someone I'm not," Ian admitted, his voice low. "He's always comparing me to what he was at my age. It's exhausting." "I understand," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. "David can be demanding." Ian laughed, the sound breaking through the tension in the small space. "That's putting it mildly." The more we talked, the more I saw sides of Ian I hadn't known existed. He was thoughtful and vulnerable, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the confident image he projected. And as the hours dragged on, I began to feel something I couldn't quite name, a pull, a quiet connection that unsettled and intrigued me in equal measure. When the air in the elevator grew stifling, I removed my jacket, revealing the sleeveless blouse I wore underneath. Ian's gaze flickered to me briefly before he looked away, his expression unreadable. The moment passed quickly, but the charge it left behind lingered. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, only to wake to find Ian sitting close, his hand resting lightly on mine. He pulled away when he saw my eyes open, his expression apologetic. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I said softly, my heart pounding. "It's fine." The tension between us finally reached its breaking point when Ian leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know what I'm doing." Neither did I. But in that moment, reason and restraint gave way to something deeper, something undeniable. When his lips met mine, It was gentle at first, tentative, as if either of us could still pull back. But neither of us did. The kiss was brief, barely long enough for either of us to process what had just happened. When we pulled apart, the silence in the elevator was deafening. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, and Ian looked away, running a hand through his hair as if trying to shake the moment from his mind. "I shouldn't have," he began, his voice trailing off. "Neither of us should have," I replied quickly, my voice firm despite the turmoil swirling inside me. "We're tired, stressed, it's the situation, that's all." Ian nodded, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. The silence between us stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "It's not just the situation," he said softly, his voice steady but barely above a whisper. "I've felt something for a while now, and I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it anymore." His confession hit me like a wave, and for a moment I was at a loss for words. I had always seen myself as a practical, grounded woman. This, whatever it was, went against everything I believed about who I was. And yet, as I looked at Ian, I couldn't deny the flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Desire, connection, and a sense of being truly seen. "Ian," I began, my voice faltering. This can't happen. It's impossible." He nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't change how I feel." The tension between us remained palpable, but the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. When the elevator finally jolted to life hours later, neither of us spoke. We stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, each retreating to our separate rooms, as if the night had been a strange, fleeting dream. The following morning, I awoke with a heaviness in my chest. The events of the night before played on a loop in my mind. The kiss, Ian's words, the way his hand had lingered on mine, as if afraid to let go. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by the strange circumstances we'd found ourselves in. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the pang of longing that coursed through me every time I thought of him. At breakfast, David was his usual distracted self, scanning emails on his phone while sipping his coffee. Ian joined us late, his expression guarded as he muttered a quick good morning before retreating to the far end of the table. We avoided each other's eyes, the weight of our shared secret hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Everything all right?" David asked, glancing between us. "Fine," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired. The elevator incident threw me off." Ian nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on his plate. "Yeah, it was a long night." David shrugged, already moving on to the next topic. "Well, I'm glad you both made it through. These old buildings always have their quirks." In the days that followed, Ian and I did our best to maintain a sense of normalcy. He returned to his gallery work, and I threw myself into organizing a charity event I had been planning for weeks. But no matter how busy I tried to keep myself, I couldn't escape the memories of that night. The way Ian had looked at me, the way his touch had ignited something I thought I'd lost. Ian, too, seemed unable to fully let go. He found small excuses to be around me, offering to help with errands, joining me for walks in the park. Our interactions were careful, almost rehearsed, but beneath the surface the tension simmered. One evening, while David was out of town for a work conference, Ian stopped by the penthouse under the pretense of dropping off a painting. I opened the door to find him standing there, his eyes searching mine, with a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Hi," he said simply, holding the canvas under one arm. "I thought you might like this for the study." I stepped aside, letting him in. The air between us was charged, every movement and word laced with unspoken meaning. As he set the painting against the wall, I felt the urge to say something, to acknowledge the invisible thread that had been pulling us together since that night in the elevator. "Ian," I began, my voice trembling. "About what happened?" He turned to face me, his expression serious. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," he admitted. "About you." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "This isn't right," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. It's not fair to your father." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "but when I'm with you I feel alive in a way I never have before, and I think you feel it too." The truth of his words struck me like a lightning bolt. I did feel it. The spark, the connection, the sense of being truly seen. But admitting it out loud felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. Before I could respond, Ian closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. And in that moment, all my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. We kissed again, this time with a hunger that made it impossible to deny the depth of our connection. His hands rested lightly on my waist, as if giving me the chance to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, allowing myself to be swept away by the intensity of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Guilt, exhilaration, fear, and longing. Ian looked at me with a mixture of awe and vulnerability, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said softly, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to stop this." "Neither do I," he replied. "But I don't want to." We stood there for a moment, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. Finally, I took a step back, forcing myself to regain some semblance of composure. "You should go," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Before we do something we can't take back." Ian nodded, though the reluctance in his expression was clear. "I'll go," he said. "But this isn't over, Margaret. You know it isn't." As the door closed behind him, I felt a pang of regret mixed with relief. I knew he was right. This wasn't over. But I also knew that continuing down this path would come at a cost I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, each day feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Ian and I maintained our distance, though the connection between us lingered in every glance and unspoken word. But the strain of keeping our secret began to take its toll. I found myself avoiding David's gaze, my once confident demeanor replaced by a nervous edge that didn't go unnoticed. "You've been quiet lately," David remarked one evening over dinner, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, waving off his concern. "Just busy with the charity event," I replied, and the elevator ordeal shook me up more than I realized. David nodded, seemingly satisfied with my explanation. But as the days passed, his questions grew more pointed, his gaze lingering on me with a subtle suspicion that made my pulse quicken. It didn't help that Ian had begun to visit the penthouse more frequently, his reasons often flimsy at best. "I thought Margaret might need help with the event," he explained one evening, carrying a box of art supplies into the living room. David raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his expression unreadable as he watched Ian set the box down on the table. The tension in the room was palpable, and I busied myself with arranging flowers to avoid meeting either of their gazes. It wasn't long before someone else began to notice the shift in my behavior. Charlotte, my closest friend and confidant, had always been perceptive, her sharp eyes quick to pick up on even the smallest changes. "You've been distracted lately," she said one afternoon as we sipped tea on the terrace. "And don't try to tell me it's just the charity event. I know you better than that." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Charlotte was fiercely loyal, but she was also pragmatic and unafraid to speak her mind. Finally, I sighed, setting my teacup down with a soft clink. "There's been some tension at home," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "David and I have been a bit out of sync lately." Charlotte frowned, her gaze searching mine. "Is it just David, or is there something else going on?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment I considered telling her the truth. But the weight of what I'd done was too heavy to share, even with someone I trusted as deeply as Charlotte. "It's complicated," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll manage." Charlotte didn't press further, though the concern in her eyes lingered. "You know I'm here for you," she said softly. "Whatever it is." I nodded, grateful for her support, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. The breaking point came during a family dinner, one of David's rare attempts to bring us all together. Ian arrived late, his hair slightly disheveled and his expression tense. I tried not to react, but the sight of him sent a pang of longing through me that I struggled to suppress. As we ate, David began asking Ian about his gallery work, his tone veering dangerously close to criticism. "You've been spending a lot of time there," he remarked, "but I haven't seen much to show for it." Ian's jaw tightened, his fork clattering against his plate as he set it down. "Art isn't exactly a 9-to-5 job, Dad. You wouldn't understand." David's eyes narrowed. Maybe if you spent less time exploring your process and more time focusing on results, you'd get somewhere. The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and I could feel the weight of their unspoken grievances filling the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "David, that's enough," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Ian's doing the best he can." Both men turned to look at me, their expressions a mixture of surprise and confusion. David's gaze darkened, and I realized too late that I had overstepped. "Since when are you his advocate?" he asked coldly, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. Ian pushed his chair back abruptly, standing up with a muttered excuse. "I need some air," he said, disappearing onto the balcony. David's eyes followed him before returning to me, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain what that was about?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. "I just thought you were being unfair," I murmured. David didn't respond, but the suspicion in his gaze was impossible to ignore. The fallout from the dinner lingered in the days that followed, the tension between David, Ian, and me creating an invisible chasm that none of us dared to cross. But the fragile balance finally shattered during an art exhibit at Ian's gallery. David attended begrudgingly, his presence a rare gesture of support for his son. The evening began uneventfully, with polite conversation and glasses of champagne, but it didn't take long for tempers to flare. As David examined one of Ian's paintings, he made a dismissive comment about its abstract style. "It's interesting," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "But I don't see how it's worth what you're charging." Ian's face flushed with anger, and before I could intervene, he fired back. "Maybe if you spent less time looking for flaws and more time trying to understand, you'd get it." Their argument quickly escalated, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. I stepped forward, placing a hand on David's arm in an attempt to defuse the situation. "David, please," I said softly. "Let it go." He turned to me, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Why are you defending him?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What's going on between you two?" The question hung in the air, freezing me in place. Ian's eyes widened, and I could see the realization dawning on his face that our secret was no longer safe. Later that evening, back at the penthouse, David confronted me. He had pieced together enough from the dinner and gallery incident to know that something was wrong. "I want the truth, Margaret," he said, his voice low but seething with anger. "What's going on with you and Ian?" I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to find a way to explain. But the weight of the secret was too much to bear, and the words spilled out before I could stop them. "It's not what you think," I began, though even I knew how hollow the excuse sounded. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I never meant for it to happen." David's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "How long?" he demanded. "How long has this been going on?" It hasn't," I stammered, tears welling in my eyes. "It was just once, I swear." His laugh was bitter, a sound filled with pain and disbelief. "Do you expect me to believe that, after everything I've seen?" The days after David's confrontation passed in a haze of tension and silence. He had retreated to the guest room, leaving the penthouse steeped in a cold, unbearable quiet. Ian, aware of what had transpired, stopped visiting altogether. For the first time in years, the home I had shared with David felt like a prison. I spent my days pacing the apartment, replaying the confrontation in my mind. David had left me with an ultimatum: end any contact with Ian and leave the penthouse, or face the public fallout of his accusations. His words had been clear and final, devoid of any willingness to reconcile. One afternoon, I found myself standing by the large bay window, looking out at the city below. The skyline was bathed in golden light, yet I felt none of its warmth. Instead, I felt the weight of my choices bearing down on me, a suffocating reminder of everything I stood to lose. As much as I cared for Ian, I knew that continuing our relationship would only deepen the fractures in all of our lives. And as much as I resented David for his coldness, I couldn't deny the truth of his words. I had betrayed him, not just as a wife, but as someone who had promised to be a part of his family. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. I left behind most of my belongings, knowing that carrying them would feel like dragging the weight of my mistakes with me. I wrote David a note, leaving it on the kitchen counter where he would find it after I was gone. Before leaving the city, I made one last stop, Ian's gallery. It was closed that day, the windows dark, but I found him inside, sitting amidst a clutter of half-finished canvases. He looked up as I entered, surprise and relief washing over his face. "Margaret," he said softly, standing as I approached. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again." I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally I spoke. "Ian, I wanted to say goodbye. I'm leaving the penthouse. Leaving all of it behind." His expression flickered with pain, and he stepped closer. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can figure it out. We can find a way." I shook my head, tears threatening to spill. "Ian, we both know this isn't sustainable. What we had, it was beautiful, but it can't last. Not like this." He reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "You've meant more to me than I can say," he said, his voice trembling. "You made me believe in myself, in my art, in everything I thought I'd lost." "And you reminded me of who I used to be," I replied, my voice breaking. "But we have to let go for both of our sakes." For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our goodbye settling over us. Finally, Ian pulled me into an embrace, holding me as if trying to memorize the feel of me before letting go. When I left the gallery, I didn't look back. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a modest but comfortable space that felt like a blank slate. I returned to teaching part-time, finding solace in the rhythm of sharing knowledge and connecting with others. David and I finalized our divorce quietly, with little fanfare. He didn't fight me for much, and I didn't ask for anything more than a clean break. Our marriage, once filled with promise, had dissolved into something neither of us could salvage. Ian, too, began a new chapter. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had accepted an art residency abroad, a prestigious opportunity that would take him to Europe for a year. Knowing that he was pursuing his dreams brought me a sense of peace, even as I missed him with an ache that lingered in the quiet moments of my days. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The events of the past year felt like a whirlwind, a series of choices and emotions that had upended the life I had carefully constructed. And yet, as painful as it had been, I didn't regret it. My time with Ian had awakened something in me, a spark, a sense of vitality that I hadn't felt in decades. He had reminded me of the beauty in connection, in taking risks, even when the outcome was uncertain. I had lost much: my marriage, my home, the sense of stability that had defined my life for so long. But I had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of myself and the courage to embrace the unknown. The memory of Ian remained with me, not as a source of regret, but as a reminder of the complexities of love and the ways it can shape us. He had been a fleeting yet profound presence in my life, a chapter that I would carry with me as I moved forward. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My story wasn't over. It was simply taking a new direction, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next.